Welcome to this short training session from the police on obtaining information and intelligence by using DP5 forms or requesting strategy discussions with the police. The aim of today's session is firstly to explain why we have introduced some new information sharing forms. Both the DP5 and the MASH strategy discussion request forms have been updated, and we'll explain why. It's to clarify which form we would ask our partner agencies to use for whatever request they may have, and then to demonstrate where to send the appropriate forms. And the main focus is to introduce our new version of the DP5, which we have redesigned to try to make it more user-friendly and to make it clear what information is required in order to obtain information from the police about data subjects. The overall aim of the session is to ensure that we have fewer rejected requests in the future, because this is one of our main current issues at the moment. When our partners send us requests for information sharing, too many of these are having to be rejected because they don't contain the right information or enough information. One of the big areas that we have found a problem with is when social workers are allocated a case that has already, for example, been through the MASH have requested this information and it has been provided already and is on the local systems for the social worker, but they don't check. There is an element of tick box work going on whereby when you are allocated a new client to look after, one of the first things you do is to send a DP5 in. Well, please, before you send any DP5, check your local systems to see if the information you require has already been shared. We've also had occasions where we have shared information with a social worker and it hasn't been placed on the local system. And then that social worker has been absent through illness, leave, maternity leave, whatever it may be, and other members of that agency are unable to access the information. We then get a duplicate request asking for the same information to be sent again. There is a suggestion that this would be unlawful if we shared it a second time because there is no necessity to share it. It is already in the possession of the agency that requires it. So therefore, it is likely that in the future, you may have such requests rejected. So it is vital both to check the local system to see if you already have the information you need, and if you are sent information by police, to make sure you upload it as soon as possible onto your system so that everyone necessary can have access to it. Another common error we have seen is that social workers or partner agencies in general are unsure which department to send their request to. And they will send their DP5 to one department, for example, our forced disclosure team, where it is rejected and they are told that the information will not be shared. And applicants have then used exactly the same DP5 to send it to a different department, for example, MASH, in the hope that the forced disclosure team may have rejected it, but hopefully the MASH department will do it instead. This is trying to circumvent our systems and our policies. I would please ask you not to do this. If you are rejected by one team and they don't tell you that you need to apply somewhere else, that means that your application in its current form is not suitable for any police department to make the disclosure. So please don't just send it to a different one. All of these problems, the rejection of DP5 requests, having to redo them, send them back in, creates extra work for you and extra work for us in the police. This is what we're trying to avoid. We are all extremely busy nowadays and we don't have time to do the same form 3 or 4 times. So we want to get it right first time and save everybody some time. Another issue that we have is that within Hampshire, Isle of Wight, Portsmouth and Southampton area, we have 3 different police MASH teams, and each MASH team has been using their own version of a DP5 or a strategy request discussion request, and we want some consistency. So we are trying to standardize the forms so they will be the same throughout the HIPS area. Then again, the old DP5 had errors in them. They were not very user-friendly. They didn't always ask for the information that we need to process your request. So we've redesigned them to try and make them more user-friendly and ensure that you know what information is needed. Because all of these problems, having DP5 requests rejected, having to rework them, etc., creates delay. And the delay in sharing information raises the risk to the child or the vulnerable adult that you're looking to protect. Information sharing is at the heart of safeguarding, and it should be done quickly, and it should be done comprehensively. Any delay to that can cause risk. So we are trying to make sure that we reduce that risk by giving you the best forms possible and providing you with the training through this package so that you understand what information the police need in order to share this information. Because we want to share information with you, but we must do it through the correct legal format. So what is a DP5? Why do they exist? These are forms that are used by our partner agencies when they have safeguarding concerns. In the main, I work in the MASH, so I'm looking at the safeguarding point of view, but it could be for offender management, it could be for many other different reasons. But the partner agency doesn't have enough information about a subject who may pose a risk or may be at risk, and they require more information from the police. This can include previous occurrences police have dealt with, associates of the subject or their address. And from the start of September forwards, we will be looking to use DP5 requests as the only method that our partners use to request information in those circumstances. In the wider Hampshire area, there are currently MASH info request forms that are used. These often create problems because they don't ask the right questions and we don't get the right information on the form and they get rejected. So we will be replacing those with DP5s instead. And any time that you simply want information from the police, you should be using a DP5 to request this. However, within the MASH, we also have a second form, which is where you are not just requesting information, but you want police action. You want police to take part in a strategy discussion. We have what used to be called the CRU referral form for this. We have retitled it as the MASH strategy discussion referral form. This is used instead of a DP5 when you wish police to take part in a strategy discussion. And we'll look at that later in the presentation. Focusing on DP5s though, what are they used for? Well, their intention is to be used to provide specific information to support safeguarding concerns. Specific is in bold for a very good reason, because we should not be looking at getting any information we can. The information we want, it must be relevant to what we are trying to achieve. When we say, can anyone apply for information? We cannot do DP5s for members of the public. That is not an appropriate use of information. However, any other agency, including obviously children's services, adult services, the health team, etc., but even down to things like church groups, can use a DP5 to request information as long as there is a clear and lawful reason for that information to be shared. We must have a secure email address in order to comply with GDPR. We will not send any information to Hotmail, Gmail, etc. accounts, it should be something like a .gov.uk account or a .nhs.uk account where we know it is secure, because this is someone's personal and private information that we are dealing with. What can you request? Well, the sky's the limit. You can request any information that you believe is relevant, that you have a legitimate reason to ask for safeguarding purposes. As it says above on this slide, we're not looking at fishing trips, but you can ask about people's associates if you've got worries about exploitation risk. You can ask about previous addresses if there is a legitimate reason to do so. All we ask is that you think about why you need this information and you explain to us the reason you're looking for it so we can judge whether it is legitimate or not. We share information from the police to many different agencies: probation services, housing associations, both children and adult services, immigration, the NHS, and many more. As long as the DP5 is correctly filled out and there is a legitimate reason to do so, we will share it. Just some general ideas before we look at the new DP5 form. What tips do you need before you start? Well, firstly, you are asking for information normally about one person. It might be several, but we call them the data subject. So the first thing you need are the details of that data subject, the person that you want the information about. We need to know who you're talking about, their full name, their date of birth, and their address. So there is no possibility that we send you somebody else's information instead. We need to know what information you need. Are you looking at history of domestic abuse or drugs use? Or is it their address you want? What information are you looking for? Then we need to know, why are you asking? Is it a legitimate request? Please explain to us the full reason why you need this information. Which brings us on to the why do I need it, which is, how will it benefit the child or the vulnerable adult that you are working to safeguard? In what way is it going to make their lives better and make them safer? It might be as simple as somebody new has come on the scene and is mixing with this child or vulnerable adult, and you want to make sure that you have the full information to safeguard them. As long as you explain it in detail, that would probably be a legitimate request. And then tell us what you intend to do with this information. What are your plans? If you get it, is it going to prompt any action, or is it just to inform the safeguarding review? Is there anything else that you are planning to do with this information once we share it with you? Now, please remember, the one thing you cannot do with information obtained from a DP5 is to pass it on to a member of the public. It is something that many people have forgotten in the past, and we have had confidential information which we have shared with you for your information only, being shared with children themselves, their parents, their families, even sometimes the data subject themselves. This is a breach of GDPR. The information is not for them. The information is for our partner agencies so that they can safeguard with a full knowledge of what's going on. Please do not share it with members of the public. If you have an overriding need to do so, contact the police first to ask whether you can or not. But please make sure that you keep this within your own agency. So moving on to this new DP5, it's not too dissimilar from the old one in looks. Now I'm just very briefly going to show you, when you first bring it up, it will probably look like this. In order to be able to access it, you have to click edit the document. Once you have done that, as you can see here, there's a little bit of explanation at the top, but then it's in sections, and those are the ones we're going to look at. Section A, the very first part, you have to select the department that you want to respond to your request. This is one of the major changes we have made to the DP5. As I'll show you in the next couple of slides, once you've selected the correct department, you get a lot of information pop up about that department, about the information they need to process your request. Then we need your details. Who is it who's making the request? And please, as I say, make sure it's from an official email address, gov.uk, nhs.uk, whatever. So in the first section, rather than writing in the department you're sending it to, it's now a drop-down list. Now, I would expect the people that are watching this training video to only need one of 3 departments from here. Normally, it will be the MASH department, but it may be the Forced Solicitors Disclosure Team if it's not an urgent case, or if it's urgent and out of hours and MASH are not on duty, you may need the Intelligence Department. But for the vast majority of this, we're going to focus on MASH because that's the most likely one. Now, when you select which department it is you want, you must then press the tab key. And when you do, it will bring up a lot of extra information for you. If you don't press that tab key, that information will not appear. So I'm going to give you a demonstration on the next 2 slides. This is what the blank form looks like. You would go to the department, you would select MASH, and then you would hit the tab key. And if you look at the change in A3, this is what happens when you do that. All the information about the MASH appears there. It tells you what type of requests the MASH will deal with. It tells you where to send your completed DP5 form. If the request that you're making is not covered within the MASH section, simply go back to department, change it to Forced Disclosure Team and press tab, and it will tell you what the Forced Disclosure Team deal with, or Intel 24/7. It will tell you what they deal with. And all of these are to make your life easier so you know who to send it to and what address to use. Then we move on to the inquiry details itself. Now, for the purposes of this training video, I have suggested a scenario where we have a young child who is in foster care. He's a looked after child, and he is requesting, and his uncle is requesting, his maternal uncle, for him to spend the weekend with his uncle. Children's services obviously want to make sure that the child will be safe. So they are sending a DP5 to MASH to find out whether the maternal uncle is suitable. So section B, here we have the inquiry date, first of all. Now that's the date when you complete the form. That's very easy, very rarely goes wrong. But the date required, often people just write ASAP. That is not sufficient. Every time a DP5 is submitted, everybody wants it back as soon as possible. But we need to be able to judge. We have different rules, regulations, and processes depending on how urgent the case is. So in the case of this child wanting to spend the weekend with his uncle, let's say it's a Wednesday and it's the following weekend. So the date required would go for the Friday's date. I need it by Friday to make a decision on this. That explains why it's urgent. If you have a court date that you need this information for, put in the court date. That's when we need to have it. Then we need the full details of the person you want the information from. In this case, it is the child's maternal uncle, James Smith. We've got his address, his date of birth. We don't know his PNC ID. That's fine. We've got enough to be able to check in. Then it comes on. Now, because you've chosen MASH and pressed the tab button, further information has come up for you. This is to counter some of the common errors that we come across with the current DP5. Firstly, if you are from adult services and dealing with a vulnerable adult, you can disregard this part. But for children's services, please read and respond to the questions. So we're not looking at section 17 or 47 inquiries, but we need the exact date the information is required and a justification for any urgency. Then The second question is, if we're looking at getting information about a child staying with or being looked after by another adult, then does it fall under Regulation 24 of the Care and Planning, Placement and Case Review Regulations 2010, i.e., is this going to be for less than 16 weeks, or are we looking at a foster placement for more than 16 weeks? If it's a foster placement for more than 16 weeks, then we are very unlikely to be able to help you. The law says that you must complete an enhanced DBS check in order to get that information. The only exception, the only time that we can help, is where you have already applied for the DBS check and you're waiting for the results, and the child is already at that address, which makes the checks urgent. Then we can help you in those situations. Then underneath this, for children and adults alike, we ask you to give the full details on the questions above and of the children and families involved, names, dates of birth and addresses. Put the answers in the box below. So as an example, this is from our child who's in local authority care, and the social worker has written, the information is required by Friday as the child wants to spend that weekend with his uncle. The request is made under Regulation 24. The child is John Smith, living with foster parents, those names and at that address, and John's parents are Mary Smith and Peter Smith at that address, and they live there with John's brother Tony. Other relevant information, anything else you think the police ought to know, this is a useful one here. John's parents are estranged from his uncle James, and Tony, John's brother, has no contact with Uncle James, so we're not concerned about Tony. Then we come on to section B3, the nature of your inquiry or interest. This is where we ask you to tell us why you want this information. What's the necessity for it? Can tell us about anything you know about the family that's of relevance, but this is not the form to give us new information. If there is new intelligence or a new crime report, please report it in the appropriate manner and confirm on here that you have done so. This is just a request for information. And then this box was missing on the old DP5 form, and it's a vital box. We want the details of the child or the adult at risk who you are looking after, who is at risk at the time. B4, information sought, is a different question from B3. This is, what information are you looking for? Be specific. Are you looking for evidence of drugs use, evidence of child abuse? What is it that you're after? And how far back do you want the police to look? Now, in most cases, we do not routinely go beyond 2 years. However, we do accept there may be occasions where you come across a data subject you've had no dealings with in the past, who's an adult, and you need to know not just the last 2 years, but if he's ever had any child abuse allegations, in which case, as long as you justify it, you can ask for more than 2 years. But in general, we ask you to keep it limited to recent history. So again, as an example, using our current example of the child in care, we have here, they have completed this and said, John is a looked after child whose maternal uncle, James Smith, has asked to have him for a sleepover this weekend. John is keen to visit his uncle, but Children's Services have no knowledge of James. They want to ensure that John's uncle is a suitable person to have unsupervised contact with him, particularly overnight. Very clear what the safeguarding concern is, legitimate and reasonable and proportionate. So far, all good. We then have the child, full name, John Smith, of that date, of that address. What information are we looking for? Well, here it says any concerns relating to the history of James Smith from police records that may indicate a safeguarding risk to John if he has unsupervised access overnight with his uncle. And they have justified in here why they want more than 2 years. As we have no knowledge of James, we would appreciate being told of any police incidents of relevance throughout his life, not just recently. Such incidents may include domestic violence, drug use, child abuse, or indications of violence, and they have put in the timescale more than 2 years. That is a very comprehensively completed DP5 that would be approved, and the information would come back before the time has elapsed. Section C is the legal basis and authorization. Here we're asking, what is the legal position? Under what laws are you looking at this? Now, the vast majority of requests are made under Schedule 2, Paragraph 2A, the prevention and detection of crime. That is what safeguarding is, preventing crime. If you are asking for information because you are concerned that the child or vulnerable adult you're looking after may become a victim of crime if you don't have that information, then you are acting to prevent crime. However, if it's a court case you're dealing with, then it's probably going to be this box you tick in connection with legal proceedings. In safeguarding, it is very rare to tick the third box, the vital interests of the data subject. Remember, in the example we're using, the data subject is the uncle, not the child. It's not in the uncle's vital interest to complete this form. There is a possibility, certainly with vulnerable adults, that you may occasionally tick that, but you normally have all the information you need about that vulnerable adult from police before it gets to that stage. So it's unusual. Most common are the first two. Okay. Then C2, please get it authorized. Pass it through a line manager just to make sure that they check the form and they can see that you have done it correctly. Okay, that's it for your bits. The next section is section D. This is for our response to you. We will complete this. If the information request is not granted, we will explain why not. But if it is granted, then later on the form, you will have the information you need. Now, these are some examples of some of the requests that we see come in on a regular basis, which we cannot grant because we don't have enough information. For example, somebody has written, Section 17 inquiry started on both children, John Smith and Tony Smith. Okay. Why was it refused? Well, we know there was a Section 17 inquiry, but we don't know why. What are the risks to the children? We don't have access to your computer system, so we can't look up the history of those children. You need to explain to us why the Section 17 was started in the first place. Just saying there is one ongoing is not sufficient information for us to judge whether it is a legitimate request or not. We also need to know how the two children are linked to the data subject. In this case, as you know, the data subject is their uncle. But if it's not stated on the form, we don't know. We need to have a clear idea of the risk and the relationship. Another one that we've seen coming up very recently is the UBB protocol. And I have a feeling I may be wrong, but I suspect there are some copy and paste templates going around that are being used, because we've seen this wording used on numerous forms where it says, as per our unborn protocol, which states that practitioners should work together to identify protective factors as well as risk and vulnerabilities, form relationships, and to agree on multi-agency safety planning for the unborn newborn baby. Can police advise if parents are known to police? Are there any safeguarding concerns in relation to parents? That all sounds lovely. Yes, you quoted a UBB protocol, which is something agreed multi-agency wide, including the police. However, this would be rejected because we don't know why you have invoked the protocol. Just because you've invoked it doesn't mean we're going to share it with you until we know why. We need to make the determination that the information sharing is lawful. So please, rather than using a copy and paste about the protocol, just explain Due to concerns about drug use, the UBB protocol has been initiated. That would be a much better completion of B3 than the copy and paste one, and probably take you less time. We need to know what risk the parents pose to the child. Please remember, we are dealing with their very sensitive information. You wouldn't like it if we shared your history with the police with somebody else just because they said, oh, they're under a protocol. You would want some safeguards to be in place. Everybody is entitled to those safeguards, so we need to know the reasons behind the protocol. There must always be justification for information sharing, otherwise we're not allowed to share it. So some tips for you. Please remember when you're completing a DP5 to be specific about what you want. What are you asking for? Why are you asking for it? And how are you going to use it? Show the link between the client you're managing, the child or the vulnerable adult, and the data subject. Provide full details of that child or vulnerable adult. Complete the form in full. Sometimes people leave sections blank. If you do that, it will be rejected. That will cause a delay, which will defeat the purposes of safeguarding. And always get authorization from a line manager. What you don't want to do is to create a template form and just change the details on there, because it won't answer the questions we need to know and it will get rejected. Each request will be specific. Please take that little bit of extra time to answer them specifically. Don't copy and paste answers from one box to the next, B2 to B3. They are all asking for different information, and if you copy and paste information from one box to the next, you won't be answering the questions we need, and it is likely to be rejected. That's the DP5. I just want to briefly talk about the strategy discussion requests. Now, I mentioned if you are simply looking for information sharing from police, you use the DP5. However, if you want police to take part in a strategy discussion, then you don't use a DP5. There is an abbreviated form that used to be called a CRU referral form. Now, CRU stands for Central Referral Unit, and I think the police stood down the CRU about 15 years ago, and that form has hung on ever since. It needed a revamp, so we have updated this form as well. This one is very similar to the old form, but we've tried to make the requests we make for necessary information a bit clearer so you know what's being asked. This is what it looks like. I'm using the one for children's services. There is a separate one for adult services that we can provide you with as well. The first section is all about your details and your line manager's details and the date and time of the incident and the location of the incident. Each form has multiple examples of child details or parents' details, whatever. I've only included one because in general, you're very, very good at completing these accurately as much as we want. So you fill in the children's details, as many children as are necessary or adults at risk, person reporting, any suspects, their parents and carers, and then family members, witnesses, or anyone else resident or present. You fill in all those details. And as I say, that is done very well. The issue comes with a blank box at the end that says details of incident. What tends to happen is that most people requesting a strategy discussion will copy and paste from one of their own documents a summary of what's happened, which is really helpful, no problems with that, but it doesn't answer the questions that we need answered. Please make sure in this box that you include the current location of the child or vulnerable adult, whether they are currently at risk, whether the child is subject to CPP, SIN, planning, or whether they're a looked after child, any relevant family history, and most importantly, that's almost never put on there, there might be 7 or 8 names on this form. Who do you want us to check? I presume you probably don't want the person reporting to be checked, but you might do. Possibly you only want dad checked, or it might be mum and dad. please can you detail who it is that you want the police checks on? Otherwise, this form is the same as it was before. It's just been slightly updated, and you would send it in to the relevant MASH. Hopefully now, having followed this process, you now understand that one of the vital things before you make any request for information from police is to check your own systems for that information before you ask for it. It might save you filling in the DP5, and it will certainly save us some work if we've already provided it. You'll understand why we have rejected a lot of DP5 requests in the past, because it didn't contain the information we needed. And I hope you now understand how to complete the new DP5 and the new strategy discussion referral form. I would ask you from now on to use the new forms to make requests to the MASH, to Force Disclosure Team, and to Intel 24/7, because these are very helpful. They will make sure you make the request correctly, and our staff will be able to action them more quickly, and it will save them time. And you should understand now what information we in the police need in order to share information with you, and finally, how to check on the DP5 that you are sending it to the correct department. Thank you very much for paying attention to this. If you do have any questions, please feel free to contact your local MASH. Ask for my details. My name is Sergeant Jim Dineen, D-I-N-E-E-N. My collar number is 24210. I would be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.